Now that my former UNDP colleagues have arrived, I think I will start the meeting on time, even though a couple of our speakers are not sitting with us. In this day and age of webcasting and virtual presentations, we have an important audience online as well as in the room, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time, even though the weather has complicated people's efforts to get to the Institute, which isn't always the easiest venue to come on a bad day. And in any case, I'm going to take the first few minutes to make remarks, so those will be less important than the rest of the presentation, so we'll get them over with, but on time. So I should say good morning and welcome to the United States Institute of Peace. USIP was created by the Congress in 1984. I was actually working in the Congress in 1984, believe it or not, that should date me. And it was created as an independent, nonpartisan center to prevent and mitigate violent conflict on a global basis by peaceful means. We moved into this new headquarters 2 years ago and are now charged under new leadership of Jim Marshall and Kristen Lord. And of course, in a new era of post-Afghanistan, post-Iraq, though post-Afghanistan is a little longer in coming, but nevertheless in a new era of global challenges. To live up to the important statement made by this magnificent structure in this hallowed location at the corner of the mall and on the river, with the crucial mandate for building peace in this world peacefully. I'm Fred Tipson, and my role at USIP is to facilitate a partnership with the National Academy of Engineering in the form of what we call a roundtable on technology, science, and peacebuilding. And in that initiative, we try to collaborate with key government agencies and international organizations, with companies, foundations, NGOs, think tanks, academic experts, to identify important opportunities to better adapt and to exploit technologies for peace-building efforts. These organizations include the U.S. Agency for International Development and the United Nations Development Program, for which I was privileged to work for 4 years before coming here. And soon, I hope, the International Peace Institute, with which we at USIP have really so much in common. We're particularly pleased today to host the Washington debut of a series of studies commissioned and executed by these three organizations. Our programs seek to bridge that long arc from the strategic analysis of conflict to the field application of strategies in key settings around the world. South Sudan, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, Kenya, Nigeria, Burma. Burma, for my UN colleagues, is Myanmar. So we are always looking for technologies and applications that will assist those in the field to better accomplish their work, using new sources of data, new tools for sensing and shaping conflicts, new data sharing platforms for better coordination among peace builders with the local authorities and stakeholders in those settings, new channels such as agricultural extension systems for bringing conflict analysis and mediation skills to the field, and more powerful analytical frameworks for the systematic diagnosis and mitigation of conflict in those local settings. Our roundtable with the Academy is focused on each of these areas in recent initiatives, and the summaries of some of that work is available on our website. Let me make a plug also for an event next week that highlights a new initiative of that roundtable, focused on environmental stresses and the prospects for improved techniques to anticipate the locations of highest risk for violent conflict from these phenomena. On Thursday, the 18th, the head of UNDP, Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand and one of the most forceful advocates for resilience and sustainability, as a new emphasis in the post-2015 development strategy. Helen will speak here at 1 o'clock on Thursday. And her remarks will be followed by a panel of experts to discuss the implications of extreme natural events as threats to peace and to U.S. national security. I use the term experts here loosely, as the panel will include me. And I am less an expert than what I would call the Chicken Little of environmental demographic threats to national security. But please register for that event on our website and join us next Thursday for Clark, Chicken Little, and my more respectable friends, John Steinbrunner of the University of Maryland and Sherry Goodman of the Center for Naval Analysis, who engaged in an important new study for our partners at the National Academies on climate and social stress. Finally, let me segue to the presentations this morning by emphasizing a point made by one of the experts in our recent workshop on sensing and shaping emerging conflicts. Prabhakar Raghavan is the Vice President of Engineering at Google, a modest title for a brilliant man. And he reminded us that when it comes to technology's impact on societies, we routinely overestimate the short-term impacts of new technologies, but repeatedly underestimate their longer-term consequences. The initial changes may seem slow and tentative, but fundamentally new capabilities can pick up speed as people change their lives to implement new innovations. Our technical brains outpace our social ingenuity, but only for so long. I'm reminded in that regard of a presentation I heard on the internet when I worked at AT&T 20 years ago. A Bell Labs expert told us in slides that predated PowerPoint, I think, that the internet would never be viable for voice traffic because the quality could never approach that of dedicated voice transmission networks. He also argued that the internet would never become the vehicle for large data transmission because responsible companies would never rely on a network with such fundamental insecurities and vulnerabilities to communicate sensitive customer and financial data. He may actually have been more prescient on the second point than on the former. But I offer this as a cautionary counterpoint to Raghavan's argument, because we can't always tell where the fundamental changes wrought by technologies will actually lead us. That is why in peacebuilding, our exploitation of technology needs to be informed by a deep effort to understand the dynamics of conflict and the importance of the value choices we make in exploiting the technologies available to us. Before I turn the podium over to Francesco Mancini, the Senior Director of Research at IPI, and the editor of the case studies we'll hear about today, I just want to welcome him formally and the other participants in the presentation. Emmanuel Letouze, who is a PhD candidate at Berkeley, but also non-resident advisor at IPA and has been associated in the past with Global Pulse, the initiative at the United Nations. Ojielo, who must be a victim of Amtrak, of which there are many victims these days, having been one myself. Ojielo is the coordinator for conflict prevention and recovery in the Bureau of Crisis Prevention and Recovery at UNDP. Garzon, the deputy director of the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation at USAID. And Helena Puch-Larari, author of the Sudan and South Sudan case study, who will be joining us midway, I believe, by video presentation. I'm also asked to call out additional editors and contributors to this study, namely Patrick Meyer, Patrick Vink, Robert Muga, Godfrey Musilla, Anna Matvieva, Marie O'Reilly, and Gustavo Dinitz. Francesco, let me turn things over to you.
Thank you, Fred, and good morning, everyone. I'm Francesco Mancini, Senior Director of Research at the International Peace Institute in New York, and it's a pleasure to be here in Washington, D.C. to present our new report on the role of new technology in conflict prevention. I want to add my thanks to the authors of the report, to our partners, USAID and UNDP, and of course to USIP for hosting us today. Now, my task is to summarize some of the key findings of this report. Let me start with a little note. 40 years ago, last week, Martin Cooper made the first cell phone call in history. the general manager of Motorola called his rival at AT&T with a 9-inch and 28-ounce phone. Now, since then, many things have changed in communication technologies. In fact, today, I think things look more like this. In only 4 decades, the total number of mobile phone subscriptions has reached almost 6 billion, corresponding to a global penetration rate of 86%. Cell phone penetration in sub-Saharan Africa now exceeds 50%. Incidentally, in 2011, China became the largest smartphone market, and experts estimate that smartphone penetration in sub-Saharan Africa may reach 40% within 5 years. The global number of internet users also continue to grow exponentially. Global access to the internet has more than doubled in the last 5 years. However, the diffusion of this technology has not been distributed evenly across regions. In the Americas, more than half the population has regular access to the internet. In the Arab states, less than 30%, and in Africa, less than 15%. So the digital divide still persists. However, I want to draw your attention to the incredible jump in interconnectedness in Africa in just 5 years. These global interconnectivities also producing an unprecedented volume of data. Emmanuel Letouze will say more about that later, but with 12 million text messages sent per minute and 2 billion YouTube pages viewed per day, the amount and variety of data produced is a phenomenon of historical significance. Now, it is against this background that IPI, together with UNDP and USAID, launched a project to investigate the potential role of new information and communication technologies in conflict prevention. How can new information and communication technologies help international actors, governments, and civil societies in their effort to prevent violence and conflict? Now, for the sake of clarity, in this study, the new technology term indicate communication, information gathering, information sharing, and information analysis that take place via cell phones and over the internet. So, for example, through social media, information mapping, GIS mapping, and so on. Now, we produced 5 case studies that have addressed conflict prevention from different perspectives, covering different regions of the world, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, different types of violence, criminal violence, election-related violence, armed conflict, and violent riots, different political contexts with restrictive or collaborative governments, and different technological tools, big data, cell phones, crowdsourcing, crisis mapping, blogging, social media. Let me now draw a few conclusions. First of all, we really did not want to design a grand theory of conflict prevention and new technologies. The diversity and changing nature of the conflict settings explored in this study strongly suggests that those seeking to prevent conflict need to adapt their strategy to the context at hand. For example, the tools and approaches used in the context of entrenched criminal violence, for example, in Latin America, in which anonymity seems critical for incentivizing citizens' use of information and communication technologies for violence prevention, are unlikely to have the same effect in a situation of election-related violence, for example, like in Kenya, in which the vetting of information is essential to avoid politicization and false reporting. So for policy purpose, it may therefore be more helpful to think in terms of the conflict context rather than frameworks suggesting the responses are generational. Ultimately, the context should inform what kind of technology is needed and what kind of approach will work best, and not grand theories. With that said, we've identified 7 concrete points that together can be taken as a how-to guide for international organizations, governments, and civil society actors embarking on preventive action that seek to leverage new technologies. Now, from now on, I will refer to these 3 categories of organization as actors, although in the report we have specific recommendations for each of the 3 categories. First, new technologies have the potential to make huge contribution to violence and conflict prevention. But actors should examine all the tools at their disposal when designing prevention initiatives, not just technological ones. Sometimes applying new technology simply may not work. Ultimately, conflict prevention efforts tackle inherently political problems. We should think politically and not only technically. Second, consider the socio-economic setting from technology penetration to literacy levels. Keep in mind that not every culture or group will have the same enthusiasm in embracing new technologies. Demographics, rural versus urban context, gender consideration, and generational factor also play an important role. For these reasons, actors should make needs assessment and feasibility studies standard practice. Third, consider knock-on effect and negative impact of specific technologies. Spoilers can leverage new technologies to incite violence. As the case study showed, restricted government can use technology to prevent information to flow or to identify members of dissenting groups. Criminal and drug lords can use personal information obtained from websites to eliminate individuals and terrorize societies. As such, political awareness and conflict-sensitive approach remain vital from the conception of an initiative until long after its completion. Fourth, once a project is underway, continual input from the local beneficiaries is vital. The case studies show that the interventions designed almost exclusively in a top-down manner are set to fail. In general, the application of new technologies tools to prevent effort at the local level works best when integrated into existing civil society initiatives. It is important that information gets to the actor with the greatest ability to respond, and this generally means the local level. Now, this leads me to the fifth point. Perhaps the most significant innovation created by advanced technologies is the empowerment of individuals to participate in conflict prevention initiatives in their own communities and societies. We know that political decision-making processes remain largely disconnected from early warning and conflict prevention mechanisms, particularly at the international level. Now, citizens can use digital technologies to more easily inform themselves and others and to incentivize positive change in their communities and societies. This information, spread horizontally, can be used to put pressure on local decision makers much more effectively than it can be done at the international level. In other words, it seems that new technologies have greater potential neither top-down nor bottom-up, but for bottom-bottom approaches. Actors should support the emergence of these bottom-bottom initiatives, providing fundings to develop local capacities, improve connectivity from different initiatives, and help the sharing of best practices. Sixth, much more work is needed to identify the level of trust, transparency, and control that individuals, businesses, and governments are willing to accept when it comes to sharing data via digital technologies in a context of conflict and violence. As evidenced in Kenya, for example, suspicion and distrust of national police and security establishments may have contributed to communities' reluctance to share information for early warning with the National Steering Committee. And finally, the seventh point, partnerships. There are indications that prevention initiatives that draw on the complementarity strength of international actors, donors, governments, the private sector, and civil societies prove more effective. The need for partnership in the realm of big data is particularly acute, given the arrays of actors involved in extracting actionable information from the data deluge. Private companies that hold the data, academics and technical experts who can analyze it, civil society actors who can put in the context, and government and international bodies that can regulate its use and incentivize cooperation. So these are our 7 points of a sort of a tentative how-to guide to leveraging new technology for the prevention of violence and conflict. We really wanted to be concrete enough for those who are planning to initiate projects in this area. Now, we believe that at this stage of application, we can only draw tentative conclusions. Most of the analysis points to the potential rather than the current reality, although there have been some significant and positive experiences. Continued and extensive research and systematic evaluation are needed for a deeper understanding of the realities as well as the possibilities. And we hope to continue to contribute to this effort. Now, more analysis information in the report, and I encourage you to read it. If my quick summary of the conclusion did not stimulate your interest enough, I hope our report cover will do. Many of you might know that Emmanuel Letouze is also a well-known and established cartoonist, and beside his excellent paper on data and big data, is also provide this drawing for the cover of the report, which I think has an interesting double reading. So many thanks for your attention. I think I'm now going to directly introduce one of our authors who is based in Sudan and South Sudan, so she couldn't be here with us today, but she sent us a video contribution of 3 minutes trying to summarize the key findings of her own case study, which is included in the paper you have in front of you. Elena Puch-Larauri.
Hello, my name is Elena Puch-Larauri, and I wrote the case study on Sudan and South Sudan for the Conflict Prevention and Technology Project. Sudan may seem like an unlikely case study for technology-enabled projects. In 2009, I moved to Kadugli, a town close to the border between the two Sudans, and I used to have to climb onto the roof of my house in order to get mobile phone signal. By the time I left in 2011, I was able to speak to my family via Skype using a dongle to connect to the internet. This is not just a personal story. Overall, internet penetration has gone from 9% in 2009 to 19% in 2012. The trend is even stronger for mobile phone subscriptions, which have gone from 9% in 2005 to 28% in 2009. The 3 case studies described in this paper show how this growing access to web and mobile-enabled technology can support conflict prevention work. Between them, the cases review the use of 4 technology tools: the CRMA tool, Ushahidi, Frontline SMS, and the Google Crisis Maps platform. The first case describes a large UNDP project that uses GIS-enabled technology to help state governments plan better. This project is linked to 2 pilot conflict early warning systems that use text messages to receive reports on conflict incidents. Although the pilots are not completed, they do indicate that there is great potential for the use of crowdsourcing to help governments better respond to ongoing disputes using up-to-date information. The second case study describes the experience of Sudan Vote Monitor, a project that supported independent monitoring of the Sudanese presidential elections in 2010 and the South Sudan referendum on independence in 2011. The project provided local civil society organizations, local media, and the general public with access to a live map where monitors could send reports via text message. This project was largely a failure, mainly because the information collected by the system did not effectively flow back to anyone who could act on it. This suggests a broader lesson that the key to successful use of technology for conflict prevention is whether technology facilitates the creation of actionable data. The third and final case study is a project of the Sudanese Development Initiative, or SUDIA. SUDIA has identified that communication is typically poor along the cattle migration routes in North Sudan, and believes that enhancing information flows along the routes can help prevent conflicts that typically arise there. With this in mind, SUDIA is implementing a system that uses a combination of crowd seeding and crowdsourcing. The system receives reports from text messages and from call-ins to a community radio program. There's also a feedback loop. Everyone who sends a text message to the system will receive and return summary text messages that are relevant to their concerns about livelihood and conflict. This case suggests that new technology in areas with a history of violent conflict can be an effective tool in bolstering community capacity for conflict prevention by building on existing mechanisms and combining analog and digital technology. A general lesson, then, is that tech-enabled conflict prevention initiatives work best when they enhance traditional conflict prevention, early warning, and early response mechanisms, working with existing structures rather than creating new ones.
it's not clicking on
While we have a moment here, I just want to, the figures on penetration of cell phones in Africa are just staggering. And at the risk of being a Bell Labs basher this morning, I'm reminded of a Bell Laboratory study that was done, and I think it was in the late 70s, maybe Chip Haas remembers, which concluded that although the Bell Labs invented the cell phone network concept, they concluded that there would never be more than 50,000 users on a global basis for cell phones. Probably because they would weigh more than 2 pounds, be a foot long, and require a battery the size of a small refrigerator. But on the basis of that study, in large part, AT&T decided not to go into the cellular to mobile phone business, and later had to buy a business for upwards of $15 billion to get back in. So these decisions have significant consequences. And as smart as the Bell Laboratories people were, and they were very smart, they couldn't foresee quite the future that we're now realizing.
I can only hope that our forecasting skills are more on the Motorola side than the AT&T now on the conflict prevention and new technologies.
This on the screen.
Emmanuel, you may need to explain this cartoon to the likes of folks like myself.
All right, so the cartoon was actually initially, I actually did it for a blog post for the International Peace Institute in November, and my initial intention was to draw these PDAs and mobile phones that would like the waves of which would, in a sense, warn against the emergence of an AK-47. So like here, the underlying idea was the idea of early warning through the analysis of cell phone data. But of course, it can be interpreted the other way around, where these PDAs and cell phones would actually sort of draw themselves, or be the cause of the emergence of an AK-47, which some people have told me that it was their interpretation. So so now I'm just making up that I actually intended to, for the cartoon to have sort of like a ambiguous meaning, but my initial intention was the former.
Actually, I took it to be sort of a swords into plowshares imagery that very familiar to those at the UN who know the sculpture on the lawn at the United Nations building. Technology is great when it works.
When it works.
Yeah. We'll change things.
No problem, but then the graphic itself should say something back on the screen.
Yeah, there's really back on here, but we cannot see it because it's stretched.
I also worked at Microsoft for a period of time, and I am constantly asked by colleagues to fix something on their computer, which I am completely unable to do. Those of you who have Windows 8 will be amazed at, I think, at some of the new functionality, but it still mystifies me as to how to organize the interface in ways that are customized for my purposes.
Mac users would normally say that would be Windows, but why are we getting a Mac for?
Well, I would go to,
I think Windows has made a huge leap in the last couple of versions.
Okay.
okay, we're good.
Okay. Bravo. All right. So sorry for the delay. Thank you everybody for coming this morning, and thank you to USIP, IPI, UNDP, and USAID, and thank you to Genève for and organizing the event. So I'm just going to give you an overview of the case study on big data for conflict prevention, which I co-authored with Patrick Meyer and Patrick Vink. All right, so this is the outline of the presentation. It's not the same outline as the case study itself, which has 5 parts structured around 5 questions. So this is just a slightly different way of looking at the same topic. So let me start by this quote by Alex Pentland at MIT, who's a professor and computer scientist who's doing a lot of work on big data. Who actually had a really great interview recently in The Edge, which is called Reinventing Society in the Wake of Big Data. And it's really, I mean, it's a very, very good summary of the debates and challenges. So here, of course, he concludes we're going to reinvent what it means to have a human society. So some people might think that it's a bit emphatic, especially in the case of conflict prevention, but still I think it sort of frames both the excitement and some of the skepticism and fears around big data applied to public policy and social science research. All right, so context and promise. By that I mean basically why do we think that big data could in any way help conflict prevention? Where is this coming from? And I think it's coming from 3 main factors. So the first factor is what people have called and are still calling sort of like the big data revolution, or others have called it sort of like the industrial revolution of data. So I've just picked a few graphs that I think summarize this exponential growth, explosion in the volume and variety of digital data. And here I've picked data that are what in the report and what they usually call big data for development, in the sense that they are these digital traces of human actions. So of course, climate data, weather data, high frequency, high granularity, rainfall data are also in a sense part of big data. But for the purposes of development, I think it's more interesting to focus on those data that in a sense translate our actions into digital data. And of course here, this is just a bit of a joke, like this sentence that I obviously just completely made it up. It's just that people say that all the time, that more data has been produced since whatever, and we don't really know what that means or if it has any relevance. And I think it's often sort of like it's counterproductive, because a lot of the data is actually really bad and crap, and people know that. So I think we should go beyond these grand statements that were quite impressive 2 years ago, but I think we have to go beyond that. Especially because, as Gary King at Harvard said very recently, so big data is not really about the data. I mean, what matters is, of course, there is much more data, but it's really the differential or peculiar nature of the data that creates the promise. And so in the report, again, we define these as because there's no definition of big data in general. I mean, it's very hard to find a definition. The 3 V's, the 4 V's, the 5 V's are not a definition. They're just characteristics of the data, but they don't define the data. So in the report, we try to define this big data for development as traces of human actions picked up by digital devices, and we try to explain why we chose this definition. Furthermore, the other aspect is that it's not just about the data; it's also about what I call here the ecosystem. It's really like the research institutions and people, data scientists and corporations and organizations around that work on the data. I think, and this is why we distinguish big data with capital B, capital D, as big data, small b, small d, plus the ecosystem. So big data with both capitals are, like in our paper, are referred to the field that leverage big data. So still within this first factor, so the big data revolution in the realm of development and public policy. So this is the report that Global Pulse published last year, which I wrote. That's why I put it here, not only. And so in the report, there are examples of applications, early applications of big data to the realm of public policy. People like Nathan Eagle at MIT and others have worked a lot on and show that worked a lot on these data and show that you can study slum dynamics, internal migration patterns following cold detail records. That you can, for instance, use Facebook to study teenage drinking, and people have done that in different places. And so in a sense also the papers try to structure the field around concepts and definitions and frameworks. One of the most important one was this to distinguish between what we call patterns, which are signals of normal behavior in a human ecosystem, if you were to model the human ecosystem, and then smoke signals, which are just abnormal values that can act as warning signs. And of course, you can see how both are related. I mean, both are prerequisites for the one is a prerequisite for the other. And so the second big factor that underpins the question why big data can be used or could be used for conflict prevention is in a sense the many changes that have occurred in the field of conflict prevention with the increasing use of technology. So what I call here conflict prevention 2.0. UN OCHA just released a report yesterday or the day before yesterday called Humanitarianism in the Network Age, that discusses a lot of the same points. So it's the role of the crowd. I'm not going to go into that, but of course it has bearing on the question of could, in a sense, big data could be applied to conflict prevention. And of course many challenges remain. It's a commonplace to say that technology is not a silver bullet or panacea or whatever other term, but it's nonetheless true. And especially the response gap, so the disconnect between data, information, and action is still huge, and technology hasn't really closed the gap entirely. The third factor is the use, especially being here in DC, the use of big data in fields that are somewhat related to conflict prevention or that seem as if it were conflict prevention, but it's not. So intelligence work, counterterrorism, predictive policing, which is used in New York, in Las Vegas, in other cities in the UK, where basically police forces crunch data and try to predict where violent acts, criminal acts are going to happen. So I've listed also other examples here. The second to last, finding bin Laden in publicly available online sources. This is a research by Emmanuel Letouze at the University of Illinois, who just released a huge data set yesterday on geolocated events. So you can Google it. And Foreign Policy had an article about it yesterday, and I think it's gonna change social science in this field significantly. All right. So the question really, this is a quote that summarizes the excitement or the promise. So this ability to manipulate big data, to visualize patterns and dynamics, and then a lot of people think, okay, let's use that to study conflict and to try and prevent the emergence and or spread of a violent conflict. But of course, on the other hand, other people think or say that it's completely naive, that it can actually be dangerous to base policy decisions on big data and data crunching, and by data scientists who sometimes have never set foot on the continent or in the countries that they provide insights on. And of course, these pertain or relate to the risks and challenges. So the first one is really, when you talk about big data, it's always big data, big brother. I don't know if anyone now still dares to use the term, because it's been overdone. But still, this notion of predictive policing, everybody talks about, okay, Minority Report. The police maybe can do that, because if you think in terms of social contract, and the police is a legitimate authority often in a country, And on the other hand, you can also think of preventive strikes, for instance, as being a kind of predicting policing. But big data for conflict prevention, it has to be very different. I mean, you can't just launch a rocket or a large scale campaign just based on prediction. I mean, you can see the tension in terms of the responsibility and the accountability. So this paper by Dana Boyd and Kate Crawford that came out in 2011, initially called, it was not originally called 6 Provocations for Big Data, but it's how it's being referred to now, summarizes the 6 risks and challenges associated with big data in general, and it's a very, very good read. I just want to focus on 3 of them. So the first one, number 5, so the first one I'm going to talk about, number 5. So just because it's accessible doesn't mean it's ethical. So it's the whole question of privacy. I'm not going to go into that. I mean, the WEF and people like Sandy Pentland are doing a lot of work on trying to reframe the debate around data privacy as data as asset, as personal assets. So it's a very interesting field, but I don't have time for that because I'm already over time. 2. I used the term last time here at USIP, apophilia, which is a term that they use. It exists, but which is this tendency to see patterns and correlations in huge data sets, just because if you torture the data long enough, it will eventually speak. That's what people criticize. And of course, and forgetting the difference between correlation and causation, which every BA student in economics or in statistics has learned. But so that's really a challenge and a risk. And 6, which we stress really strong in the report, this risk of the emergence of a new digital divide. So it's not a divide in production of data, because that divide is closing. People in developing countries, even the poorest, everybody knows that now, that mobile phone is spreading very fast. The growth in the production of data is much faster in developing countries than it is in developed countries. But this new digital divide is an analytical divide. It's who has the capacity to do big data analytics. And the capacity is in the US. If you read the papers that come out, a lot of them come from MIT, from Harvard, from Berkeley, from Oxford also has a very big center, and others, but a lot of them are in developed countries. And this is really a risk, and I'll try to explain in more detail. So this slide is a bit sort of nerdy, but it's, if you were to think of in terms of patterns versus signals, so this is a system. It's actually, I think, an engine, and this is a paper that is pretty old. And here it's a monitoring system that is supposed to detect malfunctions in the system. So if you think as this as a human ecosystem, then the first step would be to try and model the system through big data, how people behave in certain contexts. And then you could detect malfunctions, so signs that something is wrong because there was maybe an exogenous shock, rainfall, increase in prices, whatever, or the system itself collapses, and for some reason, so you can pick up. But so I like this quote by Patrick Wolf in London, that basically you could actually model human behavior. But the problem is that, and there's a mathematical reason behind it, we're very good at, and these systems are always very good at at avoiding false negatives, which means that we're very good at, if there is a crisis somewhere, it's very likely that it will have been predicted. The problem is that we overpredict. So hence the quote, we're very good at predicting 10 of the next 3 revolutions. So a lot of people now say, oh, if you go back in time, we could have predicted that event. But the thing is, the same model could have predicted 10 other events that did not happen. So in terms of policy, if you know that you overpredict, what do you do? Where do you send your trucks, or where do you act? I mean, that's actually a real challenge. Okay, just to summarize, So ethical concerns, of course, technological concerns, access to data, a lot of big data for all the talk about the ocean, the deluge of data, a lot of big data is just closed. Telecom companies keep their data. It's very hard to get for many reasons, privacy, technical reasons. So the analytical challenges also I've stressed. We have to be sophisticated users, as in, we have to try to get all the information we can. This quote is from Jim Fruchterman at Benetech. Institutional, so the risk of the emergence of a new digital divide and of re-centralization away from the field to headquarters, which goes against the trend that people in the field have been trying to push for years and years and years. And maybe there's a risk that big data could actually reverse the trend, meaning that instead of focusing more and empowering communities at the local level, now we say, okay, well, this is way too complicated. So, we're going to do that here in big US-based or other places, headquarters. All right, so just to finish on some of the principles and policies that we put forth to try and mitigate the risks and challenges as a way to sort of fulfill the promise. So there are three. The first one is to try and really formalize the debate with trying to basically put names on what we're talking about. Don't talk in the abstract. Oh, what if? It's the potential is immense. So as I said, distinguish between big data and big data, small b, small d. I mean, that's a minor point, but I decided to do that because some people use big data with capital B and capital D, and I didn't know why there would be capital B and capital D. So now at least there might be a reason. So talk about digital patterns as in sort of like normal behavior versus signals, and maybe tomorrow we'll talk about signatures, where basically patterns and signals would be the same, and you would just sort of like monitor in real time. It's a bit like nowcasting, and you wouldn't draw a strict line between normal behavior and abnormal behavior. That would just be part of like the life of the ecosystem. Importantly, we claim that we really have, if we want to do big data for conflict prevention, we have to distinguish between three potential functions of big data for conflict prevention. The first one, which we're really good at, is describing events through different big data, through Twitter data. You can do sentiment analysis. You can use CDRs, so cold detailed records. So you describe what's happening, or you describe what's happened in the past. I think we're pretty good at that. The second is predictive, and we're not so good at that for the reasons I highlighted. We over-predict. But that's a very different function. And the third one is, so diagnostics, it's are we able to explain, so to find causal paths to violence and to peace. And I think we're not very good. There's been a lot of progress in the area of understanding the causes of civil war in social science. Ted Miguel and Chris Blattman at Harvard and Yale have written a good paper on that a few years ago. But still, if we really understood very well what causes violence, I think we'd be probably better at preventing it. All right, so the right principles, do no harm. That sounds like a rehearsed development blah 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 lingua, but it's for the reasons also I stressed. I think it's very, very important to be very cautious with the use of big data for conflict prevention. So contextualization refers to the need to have not just human input in general, but sort of local insights to try and understand what a pattern in the data actually means, because people use digital devices differently in different contexts. So the same pattern may mean different things. And build these capacities on the ground as much as possible. So the anti-model is this I would say this killer robots program which exists, and there's a lot of talk about and against it. Human Rights Watch had a very good report about it a few weeks ago. So that would be sort of like the anti-model, this notion that you can have like autonomous systems that would make war. That's what the killer robots are supposed to be doing. I'm just going to skip this slide to save time. And so the third and last one, so is building the right institutions So this mirrors the fact that technology is only a magnifier of intent and capacity. So in a sense, the principles speak to the intent, and the institutions speak to the capacities. So data philanthropy, this notion that private companies would share data, would share their data, some of them anonymized, even though we know it's actually very hard to do that. But so analytics philanthropy, where maybe universities could also offer some time, or researchers could offer some time to build these capacities. Partnerships are much needed, and there are also technical tools that can be put in place through partnerships. For instance, have data that with an expiration date that exists, you can actually code that into the data, so the data lives for a year and then dies. And there are actually links also that you can also do that for links. So it's the whole paradigm of small world, big world that Patrick Meyer put forth a few years ago. That it's not about us, it's about them. So even if it takes twice as much time to build the big data capacities on the ground, I think so be it. In the long run, this is what is going to matter. And then I just end on this slide, which is extracted from Patrick Meyer's blog post on the report about the response gap and the need to empower communities on the ground. So I just leave it here for a few seconds so that you can read it. Thank you very much. Sorry, it was for time.
Thanks very much, Emmanuel. It's fascinating. Ozonnia, Ojielo, from UNDP.
Thank you. Let me start by telling two short stories to illustrate some of what my colleagues have been saying today and what I said on Wednesday. Between 2008 and late 2011, I worked in Kenya as a senior advisor to the UN system. And we supported the government to develop the early warning and the early response system. As Kenya approached a referendum on a new constitution in 2010, the government was polarized. You had different factions in the government who were opposed to the constitution, but others who were in support of the constitution. And around the constitutional referendum period, we received information of threats to people in different communities. We set up an early warning response system. People could use SMS, people could send text messages, people could fax messages. On the basis of the information we received, the National Steering Committee, which is an arm of government in the office of the president, deployed the police. The police had not received the information because they were far located from the communities, to 5 specific cases where families have been targeted and threatened because they were going to vote in favor of the Constitution. And the police went there, arrested those who were threatening them. The family stayed, they did not evict. The second story was around the last elections. I was invited by the government 3 weeks to the election to spend some time with its officers in the National Steering Committee, assess the capacity to anticipate and respond to cases of violence. And what we found missing was capacity at the highest levels to engage with the highest level political actors. There was a lot of capacity at local level, civil society. There's a lot of capacity at the middle level with state institutions. But there wasn't capacity, or there wasn't a space where people could engage the key political actors. Most importantly, to build confidence between the political actors and the Electoral Commission. So there's a lot of rumor flying around. Lots of actions were being contemplated, and the negotiation was being done in the public space. But it should be done in private rooms where the Electoral Commission could explain its processes and build confidence with political actors. So we worked with the government to create what became known as the Group of Concerned Kenyans. And they provided the mediation and the facilitation that built confidence across board. It was very significant because they simply, the political elite said, we don't want external mediation. We don't want external intervention. We will do it ourselves, we'll solve it in our own way. So if you are a victim or a potential victim in any community, facing threat, facing violence, all the big questions about the challenges and gaps don't resonate with you. What resonates? Is there a space? Can I call a number and I can have relief? I can have a solution. Are there people I can reach out to who can help protect me from harm and from violence? So does it work? It works. Are there gaps? Of course. Are there challenges? Yes, there are. So what should we be doing? The debate should not be about whether this works or whether the relevance or otherwise. The debate will be how do we overcome the challenges that we face? How do we make this mainstream that in every particular instance, if there are issues of trust and credibility between state institutions and local people, you build You build that. You capacitate civil society. So in spite of the state and its institutions, groups and communities can organize and mobilize and share information among themselves and respond. So that we can prevent violence and enhance people's security. That's the real question. So whatever gaps and challenges we see are, there should be our focus about how to strengthen this and how to make it work. So, my friends have already talked about the milestones and the big changes that we've seen happening, on issues of social media and mobile technology. And the point is true, that the solution is not technology. It's an enabler, it's an enhancer. But it's a tool that is used in an institutional context. There's got to be a package. If there's so much early warning, there's so little early response architecture. So it's actually in developing the early response architecture that technology becomes a powerful instrument that we can use. And the one or two experiences we've had, it was extremely useful, because in places where the nearest police station is 150 miles away, but you have information about what might happen, they can mobilize and get there early to prevent. Or people can move before the potential violence occurs. So it's in that architecture of response where you have groups and communities organized among themselves, and where perhaps there's some linkage established with security institutions, with institutions of government. So there's information share at different levels, capacity enhancement at different levels, responses at different levels. That's what is missing. And that's what we want to do as UNDP. That's our commitment, to build the capacity, to strengthen mechanisms, strengthen state institutions, strengthen civil society and other actors, so that they can respond. They can analyze. By analyzing and having a lens on what might happen, they can better organize their response. But it gives security institutions, even with their being discredited, an opportunity to redeem themselves with the public. And we have instances of where, in spite of the negative reputation that security institutions have, it provided them a platform where they can engage civic actors and redeem themselves. It doesn't change the ongoing work about reform, but it provides a new basis for a new relationship with community actors and state institutions to construct a future that they share together, and where the citizen expectation on security institutions is getting higher by the day. So clearly for us as a United Nations system and UNDP, we welcome this partnership with IPI, with USIP, with USAID. And we think this is the future in terms of how do we strengthen our collaboration to go forward. So we're actually looking at how do we work together to expand the opportunities that this represents. And so if you look at the reach of mobile technologies to both rural and poorer communities, the opportunities far outweigh the challenges. And let me just cite a few of those. Issues of national crisis management bodies, using mobile technology to raise awareness about preventive measures, to issue warnings, evacuation notices, and general information about disasters and conflict, even as events unfold or develop. Or using them to marshal and direct people in sudden onset humanitarian crisis. And Emmanuel has just talked about the publication by Ojielo that came out yesterday. So you avoid further danger, assess information about life-saving relief, such as the location of clinics and shelter, but also to facilitate early recovery efforts. And it can be part of an integrated community warning system that allows people to pass information to a central authority. I think that was the beauty of the model in Kenya, even with its imperfections and its challenges, that for the first time, you had community actors, civil society, state institutions coming together with the police. So it's not a Lone Ranger initiative. And many of our experience is that we put a lot of funding with civic society actors, so there's so much warning that's out in the public space. That is useful. But that warning or that support should encourage them to get into a response mode also in terms of their planning, in terms of the relationships they build with others, so that response becomes much more effective. And so it can also be used by ordinary citizens to communicate with each other and to give themselves a louder voice so that they can rally, organize, share information, and take part in inclusive governance processes and conflict prevention measures. And in terms of our experience as UNDP, I think for those who listen to the webcast or who were in New York on Wednesday, our director of our bureau, John Ryan, cited a number of examples about the support we are providing to communities, to groups, to state institutions in many parts of the world. Sometimes that support is not to resolve the problem, because the problem is structural, the problem is comprehensive, go to governance deficits, issues around human rights. And so we can support the government to address those larger issues. But from a prevention or operational perspective, imagine if you're able to do containment. You can contain the violence from spreading. You can draw a line between the past and the future by showing that it can be done. The mindset change, the opportunities offers to construct a new future is a real challenge. So from places like Georgia, along the border with South Ossetia, to Kenya that I have cited, to the example of Sudan and Cyprus, to what we did in Plateau State of Nigeria that's not heralded anywhere. Because for those familiar with Nigeria, for the first time in more than a decade, in the context of a political transition in 2011, there was not a single violence in Plateau State. And right afterwards, the violence continued. What was the difference? The difference was that the state had established a security-focused architecture of response, but it was in reaction. And we simply supported civil society to share information much more in an organic way, but to link them strategically to that response institution, just to address the issues around the election. There was no architecture we could develop, but people had cell numbers, and they distributed both cell phones and recharge cards to their partners in different local government areas. And they could call when violence threatened, and they could share the information with the government security architecture. So their deployment responded to the information that they had. They went there before. And so it drew a line between the revenge mindset that had characterized intergroup relations at that time, and they could prevent violence. So moving on, it offers potentials in terms of how Nigeria can address the challenges that it faces in focusing on a preventive, effective response architecture to the conflicts that are in the country. Or the work that's been done in Kyrgyzstan, even with all the challenges, but around the elections, in providing a space where civil society actors can engage more actively with the state in a conflict prevention lens. So clearly, in terms of what this study, offers, it offers lots of opportunities. There are lots of questions, true, and we're going to roll up our sleeves in trying to address these questions. And there's work for every one of us, international, multilateral, bilateral, civil society, the academia. We think it's important to engage in this discourse because the possibilities are just immense. And I think we're just scratching the surface of the issue. So I like to project into the future about what could happen when we have governments that, despite their incapacities and their weakness, are interested in collaborating with civil society. And we're seeing that trend in many parts of the world. Many governments are coming to us and they're saying, can you speak to us a little bit more about this thing you call infrastructures for peace? And so just last week, we issued a publication, a special edition of the Journal of Peace and Development, devoted to infrastructures for peace. Just like the whole notion of technology for conflict prevention. It's an emerging field. It is new. There are lots of gaps. There are lots of questions. But the possibilities are just unbelievable. Because what infrastructures for peace offer is to address the governance deficits in terms of the capability of the institutions to respond to grievance. So while you are reconstructing your institutions and making them fit for purpose, you have gaps you need to address in terms of the social contract, intergroup relations, citizen and government. And how are people negotiating instruments of violence? So to address that and reduce your possibilities for using instruments of violence as a tool for public negotiations, you support them to set up national infrastructures for peace. Those infrastructures for peace offer opportunities to have conversations at different levels, not just for a conflict prevention lens, but imagine a transition context where countries just don't want any outside person. So the space that is offered, and I take a classical example of Lebanon through the Common Space Initiative, where Lebanese actors themselves are facilitating the opportunities for people to come together and find common ground. On the basis of that common ground, to develop new institutions and new mechanisms for how they are governed and how people are protected. So governments are becoming interested. So we will look at the police record, of course we will, but we will say to the government, this is an opportunity to build a new relationship between your security institutions and your citizenry. This is an opportunity to show you a responsive government and to address the gaps that you face. It's an opportunity to partner with your civic actors, civil society and others, to come together and make the system work for the people so that you can meet your development gains. And so in terms of my conclusion, we will argue that we are looking at the possibility of eradicating violence in our lifetimes, at least in many countries, instead of just reducing it. But this will not be easy. So although the overall rate of economic growth continues to rise for the developing world, We also have a long way to go to ensure that this growth is equitable and reaches the most poor and the vulnerable, particularly in the fragile and conflict-affected states. This will require us to help governments and communities to strengthen their own institutions and systems for anticipating, preventing, preparing for, and recovering quickly from shocks, stresses, and crises. We are going to need much more powerful frameworks and tools, including the innovations in technology that we are discussing today, to better assist governments and communities to take timely, informed, comprehensive, and collaborative action to prevent violent conflict. So we want to thank our partners in IPI, USIP, USAID for this collaboration. As UNDP, we are extremely interested in developing programming and supporting processes that more efficiently use technology for conflict prevention. We welcome this opportunity to discuss how newer technologies can strengthen local conflict mitigation and prevention structures. We therefore welcome any ideas, suggestions, inputs you may have about how we address the gaps that this study has demonstrated, but also the immense opportunities. How do we fulfill the opportunities that this study also points to? Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ozonnia. Jose Garzon, USAID, last speaker.
Thank you. Perhaps I should just tweet my whole presentation, and that'll be enough. I think the speakers have all covered it pretty well. But still, I would like to thank the co-sponsors of the study, which is UNDP's Bureau of Crisis Prevention, the International Peace Institute, and especially our host today, U.S. Institute for Peace. I think this is an excellent partnership that has allowed us to support high-quality research, and a diversity of information, while preserving the necessary independence. Now, since everyone's had a personal story about before and after, my personal story is that about 13, 14 years ago, I helped hook up all the municipalities of Bolivia to the internet and help them communicate with each other. And that was considered really high tech back then, 1999, 2000. And I became known as the internet guy. And every time there was a meeting about internet in the embassy, I was called in because apparently I was the only person who knew anything about it at all. Of course, when I came back to the States 10 years later, I couldn't figure out how to make my iPhone work without asking my daughter to help me. And my colleagues here know how many times I swear at the new email system we've just switched over to. But what does that all mean? It means that the technology changes faster than some of us can adapt. And not just the technology changes, but violence has changed a lot. It looks very different than it did 30 years ago. And so I thought I'd reflect a little bit about going through the cases from the standpoint of the U.S. government and some of our own thinking. What are the main points that are coming out? The main takeaway I received is that we need to be very cautious about using technology and see it as a tool in our toolbox. I think as Mr. Mancini said, it's an important asset that we can engage in the service of conflict and violence prevention, and we need to invest a lot more in knowing how to do this. So at the risk of sounding a little old school, I would advocate we need to rely on some very tried and true lessons of peace building as we continue to invest in knowing how technology works. The first lesson of peace building is that the practice is best informed by deep, textured knowledge of the local context, the role of the key actors' institutions, and the things that motivate and animate their interactions. Now, technology can have a very important bearing on this context. It may serve as an accelerant. Think of the AK-47. When I saw that picture, I thought of everything feeding up to the AK-47. But it can also help a local culture become more resilient in the face of conflict mobilizers. Second, successful peace building is based on a solid theory of change. However, increasingly, that theory of change has to take technology into account. And third, we must be able to engage with key people and more people, linking community action with the action at the national level and sometimes international level. And technology can be extremely useful in this regard. Now, my old school reservations aside, it is very clear that people are able to utilize technology information in a much more horizontal fashion than when I was setting up my little internet system. This is extremely important in places where the reliability of response is questionable. For example, several years ago, our office was engaged in helping design a project currently ongoing to help assist populations in Central America affected by the LRA. Knowing that the ability of regional response actors and militaries and UN peacekeepers was limited because of the territory, we stressed the importance of horizontal information sharing with people so that they could communicate with each other. And by enabling the sharing of that information, and this allowed people to respond more quickly on their own and get out of danger. If we'd relied heavily on a very slow response mechanism, we'd actually be putting more people in danger and raising expectations that we could not fulfill. This leads me to another point that's also brought out in these case studies, which is the principle of doing no harm. Any activity in a landscape of violence becomes any activity in a landscape of violence becomes part of that landscape. Any technology activity, any kind of donor activity. And this is a point brought out in the cases. Again, it is a tool that can be used in the service of good as well as bad. By enhancing capacity, we are also enhancing the capacity of negative actors to use that tool. So we must be vigilant in how we are providing that support and reducing the risks as much as possible. No tool can ever prevent violence or conflict, which requires more than anything a political solution. See, I think you've mentioned. For example, while it may increase advocacy towards political leaders to promote peace, the success of that approach really depends upon the political landscape, the openness to leaders, and perhaps other contextual factors. I think the cases also help make this point in drawing from the contexts that are much more open than those which are closed. I'd like to end by putting on the table a subject which seems to be ripe for further examination as we examine how technology and violence work. That is namely the intersection of studies on youth demographics, urbanization, technology use, and violence. As the Latin American case points out, this region has the highest rate of technology prevention in the developing world. It also has the highest rate of violence and high youth demographics. I served time in Guatemala, and I know that the main tool for extortions is the good old cell phone. Many studies have been done in recent years, have looked at this trend between looked at the trends between youth demographics and violence. We've done some work on this as well. There is no direct causal relationship between the youth bulge and violence conflict. We do recognize the youth bulge as a factor. It would be interesting to get a more nuanced look at ways in which efforts to engage large youth populations in movements for peace, good governance, and reform could utilize technologies in the service of this forward movement. We're starting to do this already, but it's a very fast evolving landscape with rapidly developing tools. It's incumbent upon us to try to keep pace. It goes through myself, while adhering to the core principles I referred to a while ago. I hope together with our partners we can explore this topic and related topics with the same spirit of rigor and inquisitiveness and passion that have guided the production of this excellent report. With that, let me extend once again my thanks.
Well, thanks to all the panelists. We have about 30 minutes now for Q&A, which we will invite you to engage in aggressively. We have microphones on either side of the room, and we ask you to use the mics, to come up to the mics to make your comments or questions, because we have the webcast and people need to hear your voice. Feel free to make comments as long as they are short and hopefully provoke the panelists into responses. Mr. Haas.
Yeah, I'm Chip House from the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and looking around the room, I'm probably the oldest
Chip, please
person
talk
here.
into the mic so they can hear you on the web.
Where is it on?
It's on, I think. It's on.
Okay.
Just talk right into it.
I was grabbed by Emmanuel's comment about accessibility and bridging a competence rather than an access divide. And I was grabbed by it not so much because I can see the economic or social sides of it, which are there, but as the oldest guy in the room, having a 2.5-year-old grandson who's more comfortable with my iPad than I am, much more than even more than you're concerned, and having sat next to Patrick Vank at a conference for 2 days, and being able to kind of understand what he was saying. And despite all of my training as a quantitative political scientist, what you guys are talking about for old data, for big data, is very different from everything I know. And at my age, or not even if I were 20 years younger, given my technological capacities, how are we going to bridge all of the divides so that people who do have access to the technology, as I do, how do I get the technological skills to use the data, whether I'm a poor person in South Sudan or a wealthy 65-year-old guy in Northern Virginia?
Anyone want to take that on, Emmanuel?
I guess this is for me. Thank you. Well, I think the answer is that it's impossible. I think it's impossible for anyone today to actually do or know all that's required to do and know with big data. And I mean, just like, as a case in point, my background is in social science, political science, economics, and my PhD is in economic demography. Which I'm doing now. I didn't finish yet. So I was trained as I know econometrics and statistics, but I'm not a coder, for instance, and I don't know if I intend to. To become a very good coder. But the thing is, I think in this new landscape is that partnerships are really the key. When I write papers, I'm involved in a research projects with Patrick Meyer and QCRI. We're talking about putting forth proposals. There are data scientists at QCRI. There are data scientists in other institutions, and I think what is going to be required more and more is just for people with different skill sets to partner, because you need a data scientist, you need a computer scientist, but you also need people with more traditional social science backgrounds to sort of ask the questions and provide the insights that a straight computer science person doesn't have. So it's really, you have to find complementary skills. Some people are closer to having it all. There are a few of them, but there are very few. But I think it's just through partnerships and collaboration that we can make the most of sort of like the promise. And it's not just to end on this. It's not just between individuals. It's also between institutions. So when I talk about the partnerships and the data philanthropy and the analytics philanthropy, it means putting together teams of different institutions and different people with different skill sets. But I don't think anyone can do it on his or her own.
So you need to partner with your 2.5-year-old granddaughter.
Just wanted to add one comment on this and bring it even to a more banal technological level. The case of Kyrgyzstan pointed out how during the riots in 2010 in the Fergana Valley, a group of older women were given access to SMS numbers, but they didn't use it. SMS not something immediate for them. Completely different, moving into a more urbanized area for younger generation. So even when we go to something that sounds very familiar to us right now, like SMS, in some part of the world, there are still very big generational gaps. I might think that within 10 years this will be slowly solved. But that's why one of our key points was the contextualization of this technology in the society in which you're trying to operate.
Hi, my name is Marissa Martinez, and I'm from the University of California, Santa Barbara. And my question is geared more towards cellular technology. And I'm just wondering if you can comment on, the difference between the latest and greatest cellular technology and how you see that potentially helping developmental countries. And the reason I ask that is just because I personally see a difference between, the newest Android, iPhone 4 and 5, and just a Samsung flip phone and a Motorola. Or do you guys just see it as it's all cellular technology? You can make a call, you can send a text message. That's kind of all there is to it.
Just a very, very quick comment on that. Something that is important is to really distinguish. So I think, and it speaks to your question, to distinguish what can be qualified as big data and crowdsourced data. Crowdsourced data is not big data, so because it's extracted, and it's not very big, and it's not very high frequency. And it speaks to your question because I think what so like the new generation of cell phones are doing is that it increases the volume of internet-based, of the use of internet. So big data is going to increase a lot through the use of cell phones, as opposed to the old generation of cell phones, which were very well adapted to crowdsource data to send text messages and to send surveys. But I think, from my perspective, I think that's the big change that actually the internet penetration is going to be driven a lot in developing countries by cell phones and the new generation of cell phones. I don't know if that sort of.
Yeah, I might just note that I went to Microsoft's presentation last night about their new For Africa initiative, in which they are using new frequencies to increase broadband penetration, and have developed a new smartphone that's less demanding and has greater battery length and so forth. So I think the introduction of smartphones will actually be faster than might have been anticipated, even in environments like sub-Saharan Africa.
If I could just complement what Emmanuel has said. In many of our experiences in parts of the world where we're supporting governments and civic actors to set up capacities for early warning, but also for response, they're using multiple sources. So big data is actually the next frontier, but people are reading newspapers and summarizing what they read in newspapers. And it's unbelievable. Just by tracking the number of newspapers over a month, the incidents of violence that you see that sound isolated and draw empathy from you, it's amazing how you begin to see trends and patterns in terms of either the age, the victim, the location, the issues over which people are being targeted. So we are using a combination of sources. And so the SMS is, because it's crowdsourced, it invites the rest of the public to be a part of a process that sends information to either a central or multiple points. But it's a combination of all of that you analyze, and you begin to ask the question, what does this mean for us? And can we use this to know where next is happening? But then more importantly, what capacities do we have existing to be able to prevent, not just to respond? What capacities are there? How are groups organized and interacting with communities and institutions so that any response can then be effective and successful?
Over here. Thanks.
Hello. I'd like to expand a bit on a subject that I think we've touched on quite a few times during the course of this panel.
Could you just identify yourself? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Stone Conroy from Mercy Corps and from Georgetown University. Whenever I think about technology and how it's moving, how it's progressing, I think of Paul Virilio's concept of dramology. And so I think for those of you who aren't familiar with that, it's basically the science or logic of speed, which I think we've all talked about here briefly. But when I've done some work on, looking at ways to use mobile technology in sub-Saharan Africa and other places where smartphones are not ubiquitous, my thought always comes back to, why am I doing this at all? Because give it 10 years and everybody's going to have a smartphone. Why focus on things that only use feature phones or technologies that can, utilize the fact that most people don't have smartphones? It won't matter in 5 or 10 years. I'm going to ask you to, make the risk basically that the Bell Laboratory scientists made in predicting the future with this concept in mind, given that things are moving so quickly, are there sort of core principles of technology, even though you don't know what's going to happen 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, are there sort of core principles that you can predict will still be in place 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now that won't make you look, like the Bell scientists 40 years ago making these predictions that turned out to be ultimately completely false?
Should we turn to the United States government for a response?
Exactly. We know the future, but we're not telling you. My reaction is I don't think we know, and I would that was imply a certain knowledge about the future that just I would find unknowable. I think we basically are all constantly catching up, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because I'm more concerned about our ability to do the kind of basic work of peace building and use technology as we see the opportunities, where we see the opportunities, follow on those, but not let technology drive us. That's just simply my reaction as a democracy officer and conflict specialist.
Just imagine a scenario a couple of years back. How would you have communicated the fact that you are threatened? You need to walk to somewhere, maybe the post office, or send a telegram. Then you imagine how long it would take to get to your point. I'm threatened, come save me. You probably will be dead by the time the telegram reaches the addressee. So while we focus on preventing conflict, building capacity of states, institutions, and stakeholders, and all the UN Secretary General reports have, it's very elaborate. From 1992 to 2005, it is the responsibility, ownership, and leadership of national and state actors to take charge in preventing conflict and violence. We know there are capacity gaps. The international community will help, will augment that capacity, and will step in where necessary. So the key question then is how far, how effective is our support to build that capacity at those multiple levels that they can respond, knowing that as friends and partners we can support where it is needed. So our experience has been that you do your quality conflict analysis, have an effective theory of change, do conflict prevention programming with clearly what the objective is. But the use of technology has enabled faster decision making. It's enabled faster mobilization. And our focus is on response because the early warning is there. There's so much information. I like one of your citations, data everywhere. You don't chew data. It should be able to lead you to something, and that is effective response architecture. That's what's been missing so far. So from a UNDP perspective, a lot of our efforts is working with states, civic actors, communities to build the capacity for response. So whatever the technology is, and I like the illustration that Fred gives, that it should be smarter, it should be faster, it should be more effective. If we can help them make a decision quicker, mobilize the resources they need to prevent that violence or threaten them from occurring, that's fantastic. Let me end on this note. In many countries today, mobile money is trumping the banking industry. And people don't need to go to college. They don't even need to go to primary school to be able to know, say to their sibling or their child in faraway place to send money, and they know how to access that money by their phones. With that cell phone, they transfer money to another child in school so that he or she can buy their lunch. And then the rest, they go to an intermediary where they can withdraw cash. They haven't gone to school at all. So what technology is offering, it's much more than even our capacity for education to anticipate. So we welcome the change because we think it will all be positive. There will be negatives, obviously, like the case of Latin America that have been cited. But overall, if we are organized as an international community, recognizing where the needs and the opportunities are and putting our resources there, I think overall the results will be quite positive. We have more champions and more success stories we can talk about than we have today.
Just quickly, I think different ways of answering the question. One is, if I were to sort of predict something, I think I think big data especially is going to be a big part of sort of the future of policymaking and social science. I don't think it will be in 5 years. I'm not even sure it'll be in 10 years, but probably in a generation, which sounds like a long time. But I think there are really, really big challenges and resistance and institutional resistance. So I don't see that happening like very, very, very fast. But maybe I'm wrong. I've sort of highlighted in terms of institutional principles that collaboration, et cetera, et cetera. But I think more so in terms of normative principle, I think what really matters is agility. If something, I think there's something that will continue to drive the process, both as an end and a means. It's agility. So this notion of, it comes from software development. This notion of just trying small and incrementally building on what you've done. So to go back to your specific question, I think the reason why you should still sort of work with what is existing is that it just builds capacities incrementally, and it builds the ability to adapt in the future to new sources. I don't think you should wait, or you should sort of leapfrog to something that's not really there. I think the principle is really agility and feedback loops and incrementality and all these sort of like buzzwords. But yeah, I think that's really. I think these are the principles that will sort of drive the way for a long time.
Just to add one point, I also agree with Manuel. We shouldn't really wait, to do things, because of course violence and conflict, something is happening today, and so whatever tool we have at disposal today, I think it's worth investing. But I really think that the key essential point is this sort of horizontal power of these technologies today. I mean, it's a fact that the real problem that we have in conflict prevention is not necessarily we don't know, but is not act upon it. So the big gap between early warning systems and decision making is still there. This technology can bring a notch down the level of decision making. Latin American, for example, municipalities, where local leaders can know almost in real time what particular act of violence are happening in their own neighborhood, that creates an incentive, a very local incentive at the political level that is very different of the incentive you can have at international level. So I think it's very powerful.
And just a very quick last word. I think there's one field where especially big data is which we haven't talked about, but it's relevant. It's official statistics. I mean, I think official statistics are, and they're embracing like big data. But I think in terms of having the information, like a right picture of a society, they're just really starting to realize, oh, maybe in 5 years we'll be out of business, because maybe Google and other companies will know more about our countries than we put in our quarterly reports, and the data is already outdated by the time it's out. So, and I think it speaks to basically conflict prevention and policymaking in general.
Let's go this side. Hi.
Hi, my name is Casey Hastings, and I work for Motorola Solutions. So I appreciate the commercial, the advertisement there, but we've now moved on to where we do on the public safety enterprise side. So Google bought Motorola Mobility and the cell phone. So I don't have any information on cell phone, technology at this point. But we do a lot with UNDP and throughout Latin America and through Africa. And I guess I'm curious, with the handheld mobile computing, not just cell phones, there's other ways to get that information out there. Having access to that from the private sector trying to engage with the governments. Things change so quickly, and sometimes getting that information to the government on what the newest technology is a little difficult. Whether ethically they can't talk to vendors, or you can't find the right people, or again, procurement cycles and things like that just take forever to get that information out there as far as actual devices. But I guess I'm also curious about what role you see the private sector playing in all this capacity building and the conflict. We are the ones that are creating the R&D and that innovation. We want a safer environment for our workers and employees, and therefore more jobs, the economics that build up in the countries. So I'm just wondering, I unfortunately not read the whole report, so I'm just curious sort of the private sector take on that, and when you talk about partnerships, sort of what role the private sector can play in those things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. I think 6 weeks ago I was in El Salvador. I went to support our country office, the UNDP country office, in getting a better appreciation of what's happening in the country. There you have 2 leading members of gangs in detention who struck a truce. And then they want to arrest 60,000 of their followers to comply with that truce. So whatever the motivations were in coming to that truth, and they present it as quite altruistic, so it may well be. How do you translate that in the public space? Now, historically, when we engage with purveyors of violence, we engage with purveyors of political violence, because then we try to find a space where they can get accommodated and get reintegrated. But for purveyors of criminal violence, we've always used the strong arm of the state with a security, with the rule of law approach. That's how we address them. Now, but the purveyors of violence, not just in El Salvador, but in many of these communities, live in communities. And the biggest targets are people in their neighbors. So they've got to go home. So while you use the strong arm of the state to address what they've done, they still need to come to terms with the neighbors about the violence they've perpetrated against their neighbors for a very long time. So you have to address issues of reintegration. You have to address issues of community cohesion. You have to address issues of reconciliation. And so some of the conversations were with private sector, both in terms of how you support reintegration perspectives, but economic opportunities for young people. So they're huge. So I'd love to speak to you well after, outside this forum, and to speak to others who are also interested. At some point, we were speaking to some of the colleagues, for example, in Google, and we said, imagine a situation where we're able to install operational capacity situation rooms with willing civic actors or in governments, with all the caveats and the understandings, particularly to ensure effective participation by all stakeholders. So it cannot be in the Ministry of Interior, it cannot be with the intelligence agency, it's going to be in some kind of autonomous body, but that effectively links to the security architecture. Because the most effective response is by the security architecture. From a preventive side, of course, by civic response. So if we have capacity to install that, capacity that allows you to feed information on a very timely basis, and then to analyze that information and to send it right back in terms of civic actors at local level, imagine the effectiveness of the response. So it's not actually about money we're asking for. We're asking for partnerships that allow us to use the tools of technology to enhance communication, enhance decision-making, enhance the gathering, but also the analytics of the information. So final point, if you do a disaggregation of what the conflict issues are in country, and we have technology that allows us to quickly categorize them, and as the information is coming through from newspaper sources, from broadcast media, from SMS, you name it, but it allows us to quickly categorize and say, this is threatening. So I can see right away there's threatened violence, then you pick up the cell phone, you call the police commander, and says, this what, are you aware of this information? How have you responded? You call civil society. What have you done to try and build trust or have a conversation between the groups in conflict so that this doesn't happen? If we have all of those and we can begin with 1 or 2 or 3 champion countries, we can make a world of difference. So there are lots of possibilities, and for us as UNDP, we are keen to develop those partnerships with institutions that are interested. And we can start in any part of the world if that's where your corporate interest is. Thanks.
So just a few words on. So the short, shallow answer is that none of this, and this again, I mean big data and is going to happen without the private sector. Yeah. It's a commonplace, but it's and actually people know that. In the realm of, to go back to the example of official statistics. So I'm as the bio alludes to, I'm working with the OECD Paris 21, which is the technical assistance arm of the OECD on official statistics, and we did a survey recently to ask national official statisticians how they view big data and who they thought would be better positioned to help them engage with big data. And we asked whether it was going to be the private sector, the government, NGOs, and the private sector came first by a wide margin. So even in the public sector, I think people are well aware that the private sector is a key partner. But then of course there are challenges on both sides. On the private sector side, we all know that so Microsoft, IBM have amazing analytics capacities, SAS, etc., etc. But sometimes I'm not really sure that it's always entirely genuine. I don't know if there's a lot of CSR, there's a bit of PR. So I think we have to make sure that we go beyond that. On the UN side, for instance, when I worked at Global Pulse, we had the hardest time. And I'm not working for the UN anymore, so I cannot be let go. We had the hardest time to get into agreements with private companies, even those, or especially those that were willing to work for free. And lawyers and I don't know, maybe they're right. Maybe the UN should be protected, but it took us almost a year to get an agreement with some private companies that were willing to work for free. So we should, and in a sense that was great because it was the first time but we should really, I don't know who's the we, I don't know how, but there needs to be ways to just, work together, in 1 week on something, and that everybody is on, has the same goal, public good, whatever, peace and happiness in the world. But it was really infuriating to see the hurdles on both sides.
Thank you for that burst of idealism there at the end. That was very helpful.
I just want to add one.
We have just 5 more minutes, so Jose, did you want to say?
I was saying in Central America, it was the private sector more than any other single group, together with the evangelical churches, that played a role in combating youth violence. They were the ones who took the lead, and and what we did there was something that was very low tech. Of course, we put gang members, reformed gang members, trying to set up their businesses. We put them on a reality TV show that they sponsored, and it began to change the dialogue because we put a human face in front of a problem. It's different than just talking about a problem conceptually, and they began to see, yes, this is a kid who's had a very violent life who wants to come back in. It was the private companies that opened their doors and allowed youth to come in and work for them at some risk to themselves. So the private sector is absolutely critical when you're dealing with youth and violence.
So we'll try to take the last 2 questions going either way here. I just wanted to observe, though, that one of the more powerful applications of smartphones for development as well as peace building is the camera itself. It's just being able to take pictures for various kinds of use, whether or not there's any communication attached to it. Now, the other point I wanted to make was that it's easy to be high-minded about the value of some of these technologies, but at the end of the day, people find innovative uses for these technologies that don't always follow the predictions we might make. And I recall, though it may not sound politically correct, doing a high-minded study in South Africa for what the most common applications were of the cell phone. This was 10 years ago. And interviewing a fellow about, what are you really using your cell phone to do? Are you for tracking medicine, for learning things from colleagues and so forth? And he said, really, this has multiplied the number of girlfriends I'm able to manage on a simultaneous basis. And that's the biggest significance for me. So you never know just what the actual volume of traffic is going to be in some of these applications. Let's go this way.
Okay, thanks, Fred. It's Bernard Harborn from the World Bank. And just congratulate the team on a very interesting set of presentations and look forward to the report and reading the report and collaborating in ways forward. I think you very well set out both the potentials and also the limitations and hazards related to technology, and particularly the nexus. I think, Ozonnia, you articulate very well, the nexus between how that technology is used within the institutional and political spaces in terms of response, and that's clearly a difficult thing to broach, both as an international actor, and particularly this is something that we're contemplating from the World Bank side, because obviously violence is essentially inherently political in many ways. Just 2 quick questions. One is, talking of cameras, you've talked about surveillance and big data, the degree to which the teams have looked at other forms of surveillance. I'm thinking of satellite technology down to drones, down to CCTV cameras. We get asked all the time to fund, particularly in urban programming, CCTV. And then the second, no comment on the panel, because you did have a woman colleague from Sudan, but is not only the generational split, but whether you've picked up differences in gender, and particularly dealing with one typology of violence that you didn't mention, which was gender violence, and particularly domestic violence, and whether there's any research on the application of technology to contend with that. Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah, let's take the last question, Matt, and then we'll be able to respond.
Sure. I'm Matt Levinger. I worked on conflict analysis and prevention at USIP for 4 years, and now I'm directing the National Security Studies program at George Washington University. I applaud the panel and the study, particularly the common thread that technology is valuable only to the extent that it's embedded within relationships that facilitate effective action. That said, it seems to me that there are sort of two flavors of the take on technology represented in this panel and in the field more generally. One is kind of the low-tech version, where basically you take the technology, or you take the information however you get it, and you use it to forge action networks. And personally, I that's the side I find most appealing. The other side is, let's get really good data, really good analytics, and see what we can do with it that we haven't been able to do so far. But I'd like to just, and I don't even think you have time to address this question at all, but let me give one example on this big data side where I think there's a pressing need for action, but it would involve better institutions and relationship building, and that is global conflict mortality. We have absolutely no idea whether deaths from violent conflict have gone up, down, or sideways over the past 20 years. I mean, there are data sets that will point you in a whole range of directions on this. But this is, you know, okay, so I guess my question is, how do you harness effective data collection to get an answer to a question like that? I mean, who's dying where in the world due to violent conflict?
Let's just go down the line and give people a chance to deal with questions or any other comments they want to make at the end.
Sure.
Francesco?
Just quickly, a few words. You know, I agree on that characterization of the sort of low-tech, high-tech, and I think a lot of the things that are happening right now in conflict prevention are more low-tech based. I think something that's also emerging from the cases is always a mix of technologies. Very mixed of very traditional technologies with more high technology. Fred just mentioned the power of images. I belong to those who think that part of the spreading of the Arab Spring is due to the fact that most of the young people had a phone in their camera. That today we can see images that in the past we couldn't. If you Google the Hama massacre in 1982, you still cannot find one single picture of the actual violence that took place in that city. This is something today absolutely not possible. So as much as we can do in spreading these images, I think has a strong power to fill that gap between early warning and action. In terms of the death-related, battle-related death statistics, I mean, all the statistics, most of the statistics that I know, the Uppsala database as well as AndyMax in Canada with the Human Security Report, they're all reporting that there is a decrease in the number of casualties from war. People dying in battle-related, battle-related death has been decreasing in the last 20 years to the point that some people has been starting to try to correlate this with the strong engagement that today we have in conflict, from mediation to peacebuilding, peacekeeping, and so forth. And if this is really making some kind of difference on the ground, it's very hard, of course, to prove that. But there is clearly a stronger engagement in the international community in conflict, and so we're getting much better in decreasing the level of violence. Gender-based violence, very interesting question. I'm not aware of specific studies on that. I know that in DRC there's been an attempt to distribute phones for that specific target, but I'm not aware of anybody testing how this is responding. So I think it's an interesting point.
So just to take the question where they came. So Bernard's question about, so two questions really. So one about like remote sensing, and I mean that's my interpretation of it, or my answer. So remote sensing and satellite images. So I think so there are, there are different levels at which it's relevant for conflict prevention, and I'm sure you're aware of these projects. But so I think one in terms of really directly relevant to conflict prevention, you can cite the Sentinel project, and other attempts at sort of taking pictures of refugee camps and trying to infer the number of people and infer the number of people who are going to move from the camps or down some corridors, especially in Somalia. So this is sort of like being done. There are also other uses that are sort of less directly applicable, but so you can think of them as supporting structural prevention efforts more than operational early warning. For instance, taking light emissions at night, where you can infer economic activity and GDP and maybe sort of poverty figures. Also, the use of fertilizer, because from space you can actually detect the use of fertilizer. So, just to say that you can have like different data streams that you can use to sort of model what's going on at a community level. Maybe if the use of fertilizer is going down, it's a sign that poverty is increasing or supply chains are being disrupted. Anything. I mean, you can see the causal. On gender, the only thing I can think of that sort of related to your question is it's being, I think, proven that male, and you can infer whether a user of a phone is a male or female just by the way people use the cell phone. Who they call, for how long. So I know this sounds like sort of a bit I don't know the term, but you know what I'm talking about. But it's and the
I thought I was
like,
politically incorrect.
Yeah. Yeah, the final comment was. So again, in terms of modeling, so it's not directly relevant to gender-based violence, but you can infer from cold detail records. Basically, you can an age structure. I mean, you can, and people have done that in Brazil, for instance, trying to reproduce census data from cell phone data with training data. So, and then in terms of the low tech, high tech. I think, for instance, I mean, I also work in conflict and like more traditionally, and I think it's a great example of something that starts with a question. So if your research question could be, is mortality going up or down? And if we think we don't know, then maybe using big data, you could set up like research protocol where you would actually try and answer the question. I don't really know what the protocol would be, but just to lead, for instance, so Caleb Letarou's data set that we just published could be a great starting point, because you can map events, geolocated events, super high frequency and granularity, and sort of outcomes, like. And then the question would be, if you have a DHS, or if you have a census, or if you have something, what is the correlation, and can you try and infer whether mortality and other public health data, whether mortality is going up or down, by just like merging and trying to crunch the. But it starts with a question, and I think it's always the best way to start.
I think the question about mortality and low-tech, high-tech issues have been addressed. So maybe I should spend a few seconds on Bernard's question. There's actually a lot of work that's been done, but I'm not sure it's been well captured and put out there in the public domain. Number two is that for quite a while, we split a lot of hairs in setting up crime observatories that just focus on criminal behavior and the larger framework of response capacity in terms of situation rooms and getting all of that information, and they speak to the same issues. The evidence of the crime may be a manifestation of some social tension or social challenge that exists in the community, and a lot of the information that manifests as crime was also a result of socio-political, economic, and other kinds of stresses and tensions in the society. So, I think what might help and what we hope to support, it's if there's focus at either the national level or sub-national level, to track the collect information and evidence about violence and to develop effective response capacity. You can have a protocol that allows you to capture different data sets, different kinds of information, disaggregate the information, recognizing that you have to have different end users. Some of that information will end up with security agencies in terms of planning their anti-crime response, mobilizing civic actors for community policing and all of that. A lot of that information will deal with the larger social and political issues for which the same actors can actually play different kinds of roles. But I think there are a few cases where you have crime observatories where the questions are finally disaggregated that allows you to capture issues around violence against women. The other point, of course, is sometimes this distinction about the institutional response and institutional mandates don't allow us to pull together the broad strands of information that we have So whether it's an issue focused on women and women's issues like UN Women, or an issue that focuses broadly on UNDP, like any of the multilaterals or major development institutions, that harnessing of the information from both sides is part of where I see the challenge lying. So that potentially means that there's work for us to do. How do you specifically then capture more information that relates to gender violence? And whether that's also an indicator of larger societal violence. A few years ago, we actually sponsored a study by UNDP about, the masculinities of violence. And it was quite interesting about how that could be predictive of the kinds of behavior in societies in relation to larger social violence. But, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Jose, let's give you the last word.
Really nothing new to contribute. Other than that, we've recently launched what we call a grand challenge on atrocity prevention, the use of technology for atrocity prevention. I hope that we can issue a few grants soon, and that would tell us a lot more about how we can use technology to track and prevent mass atrocities. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, I lied. I'll have the last word. I just wanted to thank not only the panelists, but Geneviève Bergeron for helping to organize this whole effort. Outstanding contributions here in these studies, and I hope people will take the time to look through the more detailed studies, because I think they will be important additions to the literature and to the knowledge that we've got on these subjects. So please join me in thanking the panelists.